What if a decade could change the face of a nation forever? Welcome to the story of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In the mid-20th century, a seismic shift occurred in the People's Republic of China. It was the year 1966 when Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party, launched a campaign that would dramatically alter the course of Chinese history. This was the onset of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, a movement primarily aimed at preserving the fervor of Chinese communism. Mao feared that capitalist and traditional influences were corrupting the society and its communist ideals. The solution? A vigorous purge of these elements, an aggressive cleansing of what he perceived as impurities. The revolution sought to eradicate capitalist tendencies and revive the revolutionary spirit by enforcing a strict communist doctrine. This meant dismantling old customs, habits, and ideas, anything that could potentially undermine the socialist framework. The Cultural Revolution set China on a path of profound transformation, affecting every corner of its vast society. This dramatic decade reshaped China, but at what cost? Let's dive deeper. It all began in 1966, but what sparked this monumental period in Chinese history? As Chairman Mao Zedong sensed his grip on power weakening amidst the criticisms of his economic policies and the disasters of the Great Leap Forward, he plotted a dramatic comeback. Mao understood the power of the youth, their energy and their capacity for transformation. Thus he turned to them, mobilizing a vast army of young people known as the Red Guards. The Red Guards, primarily students, were rallied by Mao's call to perpetuate the revolutionary spirit. He urged them to challenge authority and to attack the four olds. Old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. This directive was not just metaphorical but led to a literal upheaval. Temples were defaced, books were burned, and anything that represented the old ways, including traditional clothing and artworks, was destroyed or denounced. As the Red Guards gained momentum, their actions grew more violent. Teachers, intellectuals, and anyone perceived as an embodiment of the old values were publicly humiliated, persecuted, or even killed. Families were torn apart as young people turned against their parents, denouncing them for clinging to the past. The chaos was not just limited to urban areas, it spilled over into villages and remote corners of the country. This movement was not a mere cultural shift. It was a radical attempt to reshape an entire society forcibly. As the Red Guards surged across the nation, the very fabric of Chinese society began to unravel. Imagine a world where your culture's history is under attack. This was the stark reality during China's Cultural Revolution, a period marked by an aggressive campaign to reform the societal structure, which deeply scarred the educational system, art, and intellectual society. At the heart of this upheaval was the closure of schools across the nation. Education systems were seen as breeding grounds for bourgeois ideology, contrary to the proletarian culture promoted by the regime. For years, classrooms sat empty, as students were mobilized to join the Red Guards instead of pursuing academic studies. The impact was devastating, creating a generation whose educational opportunities were severely disrupted or altogether halted. In the realm of art and culture, the revolution's effects were equally destructive. Ancient relics, books, and artworks were destroyed under the pretext of eliminating the four olds. Old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Museums were ransacked and libraries burned to the ground. Even the Forbidden City, the emblematic heart of Imperial China, narrowly escaped complete destruction. Traditional Chinese opera was transformed into revolutionary operas, which exclusively glorified socialism and the achievements of the revolution. Intellectuals, the custodians of knowledge and culture, faced severe persecution. Labeled as counter-revolutionaries and enemies of the state, many were subjected to public humiliation, imprisonment, or worse. This campaign against intellectuals was not just about eliminating opposition, but also about fundamentally reshaping Chinese intellectual thought to align with Maoist ideology. The Cultural Revolution sought to enforce a radical egalitarianism, but at the cost of a profound cultural and intellectual vacuum. The legacy of this period is complex, influencing contemporary China in ways that are still being unraveled. The scars left by this cultural purge remain evident in the voids of Chinese historical and cultural landscapes. By the early 1970s, the winds of change began to blow through China. The fervor that once fueled the Cultural Revolution began to wane. The Red Guards, initially powerful instruments of Mao Zedong's radical policies, found their influence diminishing. This was a group largely composed of zealous young students who had been at the forefront of enforcing the Cultural Revolution's more extreme measures. However, as the consequences of their actions, chaos and instability, became apparent, the tide started to turn against them. The Chinese military, a more structured and disciplined force, was called upon to restore order. This intervention marked a significant shift from the chaos that had engulfed the nation. Soldiers replaced the student radicals in the streets, and the power of the Red Guards disintegrated. The once fiery scenes of youth-led rallies and public denunciations faded, as calm and structure slowly returned to the public life of Chinese cities and towns. In the midst of this restabilization, in 1976, Mao Zedong, the architect of the Cultural Revolution, passed away. His death created a power vacuum and signaled the beginning of the end for the Cultural Revolution. Shortly thereafter, the Gang of Four, a political faction closely associated with the more radical aspects of Mao's policies, was arrested. This group's fall from grace was swift and marked a decisive end to the tumultuous period. With Mao's death and the disbandment of the Red Guards, China stood at the threshold of a new era. The revolution was over, but its echoes could still be heard. In the wake of the Cultural Revolution, China found itself grappling with the profound disruptions it had caused in every facet of society. The landscape was one of intellectual devastation, economic disarray, and a cultural void. The task of rebuilding and healing was monumental, leading to the initiation of the Boluan Fanzheng policy. This policy, which translates to eliminating chaos and returning to normal, was introduced by Deng Xiaoping and his leadership in the late 1970s. It marked a critical pivot from the radical ideologies that had previously dominated, focusing instead on practical reforms. The primary aim was to correct the mistakes made during the Cultural Revolution, restoring the civil service exams, reviving educational institutions, and rehabilitating thousands of people who had been persecuted. Education, which had been a major casualty during the tumultuous years, saw a significant transformation. Schools and universities reopened, and educators who had been sidelined or punished were reinstated. The curriculum once again emphasized academic rigor over political indoctrination, seeking to nurture a generation that could contribute to national growth rather than political zealotry. Economically, the Boluan Fanzheng policy ushered in an era of reform and opening up. This approach not only stabilized the economy but also set the stage for future growth. Agricultural policies were overhauled, allowing market forces to play a greater role, which increased productivity and raised living standards. In urban areas, the focus shifted towards developing a diversified market economy, laying the groundwork for China's future status as a global economic powerhouse. The societal fabric, torn by years of ideological strife, began to mend. The government made concerted efforts to depoliticize everyday life, reducing the omnipresence of Maoist thought and promoting a more pragmatic approach to governance. As the years passed, the scars of the Cultural Revolution began to heal. With a focus on technological advancement, international trade, and cultural exchange, China was not just recovering, it was transforming. China began mending its wounds, slowly rebuilding the bridges that had been burnt. Decades later, the Cultural Revolution still casts a long shadow over modern China. This was a period marked by upheavals and transformations that have shaped not only the nation's political landscape, but also its cultural and social fabric. The Cultural Revolution, initiated by Chairman Mao Zedong in the mid-20th century, was aimed at preserving Chinese communism by purging remnants of capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society. However, its effects were far more profound and enduring than mere political realignment. One of the most significant impacts was on Chinese politics. The revolution entrenched a style of governance that is highly centralized and control-oriented, a legacy that can still be seen in today's Chinese government structures. It instilled a caution in subsequent leaders about the dangers of unchecked power and mass movements, influencing how policies are formulated and implemented. Culturally, the revolution aimed to eradicate old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. While it succeeded in part, the aftermath was a society in cultural disarray, struggling to reconnect with its past, yet needing to forge a new identity. Today, there is a palpable tension between revivalist movements that seek to bring back traditional philosophies like Confucianism and the state's push towards modernization and global integration. In terms of societal impact, the scars left by the Cultural Revolution are deep. Families were torn apart, education systems were disrupted, and millions of lives were irreversibly changed. This period has been a subject of intense public memory and debate within China. The government's control over narratives and the selective censorship in discussing this era highlight the complexities of public memory in China. Globally, the Cultural Revolution influenced how other nations viewed China. It painted a picture of a country in the throes of self-inflicted chaos, affecting diplomatic relationships. Over time, as China emerged as a global economic powerhouse, perceptions have shifted, but the shadows of those tumultuous times linger in diplomatic corridors. As we reflect on this tumultuous period, we realize the profound impact it has had not just on China, but on the world stage. The Cultural Revolution, with its deep-seated influences and dramatic history, continues to be a point of reference for understanding China's path in the global arena and its internal dynamics.